Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Avodah Zarah Daf and Gimel, but we're going to start on the bottom of the Beis Beis at the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us, before we start the Mishnah, we want to say that the Daf is dedicated for Shemir for Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael in this Eis Torah. The Mishnah tells us, Ove Kochavim, Mevatel Avodas Kochavim Shalo, V'Shel Chavero. An idolater can nullify the idolatry of himself and of his friend. The Israel, but a Jew is not able to nullify the idolatry. Israel, the Jew cannot nullify the idolatry of an idolater. One who nullifies the idolatry, automatically also nullifies all the utensils that serve it, all the implements that help it. But if he nullifies just the implements that serve it, and those who serve it are permitted, but the idolatry itself is prohibited. So says the Gemara, Masni Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. So this was how Rebbe taught. Masni Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. Rebbe taught this brayso to this Mishnah to Rabbi Shimon by saying Ovi Kochavim Mevata Avodas Kochavim Shelo V'Shel Chavero, like exactly our Mishnah, the way our version. But Amar way, but when he said this to his son Rabbi Shimon responded, Rebbe Shanisa Lanu B'Yaldu Secha. He said, he called his father Rebbe. He said, he taught us when we were younger. Ovi Kochavim Mevata Avodas Kochavim Shelo V'Shel Yisrael. Idolater can nullify the idolatry of himself and of a Jew. And V'Shel Yisrael, the Yisrael Mika Mevatla. So he said an idolater can nullify the idolatry of himself and also the idolatry of a Jew. So the Gemara asked the question, wait 1 second, how could Rebbe, when he was younger, have taught this question, taught it like this? The Yisrael Mika Mevatla. How could an idolater nullify the idolatry of a Jew? Because how can the idolatry of a Jew ever be nullified? It says that the Jew, if he has an idolatry, he has to place it in secret. So I'm Rabbi Hill, Rabbi Volas, that we're talking about a case where the idolater has a partnership with the Jew. So then he'd be able to nullify it. So when he was younger, why did Rebbe say that the non-Jew can nullify the idolatry of the Jew? And when he was older, why did he think that he couldn't? So the Gemara explains, when he was younger, he said the Jew serves based upon the mindset of the idolater. Since the idolater nullifies his own idolatry, he's also nullifying the Jews. When he was older, he was of the opinion that the Jew nullifies, worships the idolatry on his own mindset. And when the idolater nullifies the idolatry, he nullifies only his own half, the Yisrael Obato, but he doesn't nullify the Jews. But some have this discussion of Rebbe and Rebbe Shimon as Seifa on the second clause of the Mishnah, which says Yisrael Eino Mevata Avodas Kochavim Shel Kochavim, which says that a Jew cannot. Some have the statement of Rabbi Hill and Rabbi Volas on the second clause of the Mishnah, which says that a Jew cannot nullify the idolatry of an idolater. So the Gemara says, Shita, it's obvious. So Amar of Hill, Berei de Rabbi Volas, he says, on top of Nun Gimel Amid Aleph, or Nitzracha, D'yesh lo bas shutfus. No, we're talking about a case that there's a partnership. The Kamash Malan, Yisrael hu dulam mevatel do'ovi kochavim, that a Jew is not able, that under those circumstances, the Jew cannot disqualify the portion of the idolater, but The idolater can nullify his own portion. And we don't say that since he cannot nullify the portion of the Jew, also himself is not able to nullify. We don't say that. Some say that this was taught about a brisa that Rabbi Shimon Manasseh says, Omer, Avodas Kochalim Shal Yisrael, Eino B'Telo Olamis, that the idolatry of a Jew can never be nullified. My Olamis, what does it mean forever? What does it mean when it can never be nullified forever? Meaning to say, it could have just said it can never be nullified. What does it add these words forever? So Amar Rabbi Hillel, B'rei D'Ravolos, Lo Nitzach Al Sheyesh Bo, Lo Ovid Kochalim Bo Shutfis. The Mashwan Yisrael Adate Dinafshi Poch. It's teaching us even in this case where the Jew is in partnership with the idolater, that it can never be nullified, that the Jew worships the idolatry on his own. So now it says the Mishnah, how do we disqualify an idolatry? If it's in the form of a person, kata rosh azna, you chop off the tip of the ear, or rosh chotma, or the tip of the nose, or rosh etzba, or the tip of the finger, or pechasa, or basically you dent it, afal pishalo chetzra, even though you have not actually diminished the, the amount that's there, because you just dented it, bitla, it's disqualified. Rak b'fanel, or hishtim b'fanel, or gerera, zark basat soa rezu ein betila. If you spit in front of it, or if you urinated or dragged it, or you threw some feces at it, it's not disqualified, because since you didn't do an action to change its form, even though you disrespected it, it's not disqualified. Because we say that even though right now you're angry at it, maybe he's going to come back in the end and forgive it. Let's say you sold it or you pledged it in exchange for some money. Rabbi Omer Bita, Chachamim Omer Bita. Rabbi says you've disqualified it, and Chachamim say you have not. So the Gemara says, Kilo Chusra, if we're talking about, let's say you just dent it, we say that that's a form of disqualifying it. But Kilo Chusra, but since it's not missing anything, you just dented it, Amai Bitla. So how have you disqualified? Amar Rabbi Zera Shepechasa Pefaneha, that you smushed in its face and thereby made it deform. If you spit or you urinated, you have not disqualified it. So, what's the source for this idea that even though you stopped using it in the beginning, but in the end you're going to come back and use it, and therefore it's not disqualified? Gemara says, Amar Chizkiah, the Amar Kra, it says in the pasuk about the 10 tribes of the Jewish people, that when they were exiled, meaning to say when it's a time of famine and distress, they're going to be upset at their idolatry and they're going to curse it and they're going to go back to heaven and they're going to ask God to save them. It says afterwards, and he turned to the earth and it was behold, it was tzara v'chashecha, dark and narrow, distressed. Nevertheless, even though he cursed his false god, nevertheless, after he rested, he turned back to the land. And so we see that if the idolatry is not totally destroyed, you haven't gotten it out of your system. If you sold it or deposited it, Rabbi says that it is disqualified, and Chum say it's not. Ziri Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ziri says Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav, Chad Amar Machokes, Bitzarf Ovekochan. The one says, there's a dispute between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, that one says that the dispute between Rabbi and Rabbi Chachamim is talking about where he sold it to an idolater who was a tzaref, he was a workman who works with the metal. According to Rabbi, that the person who buys it is going to melt it down and fix it. And so therefore his intent is to break it. And so, whereas according to Chachamim, he doesn't intend to do this because he's of the position, the one who purchases it will worship it. And so therefore, not break it. So therefore it's not disqualified. But if he sells it to a Jew, Divrei Akol Bitel, everybody says it's nullified. But one of the two says, B'tzoref Yisrael Machokas, that the dispute is by a Tzoref Yisrael, we sold it to a Jewish craftsman. And according to Rabbi, it's nullified. According to Chachamim, it's not nullified. So the Gemara says, so what's the law by a person who's not a Jew, according to the second approach? Do they say that the dispute is by a Jew who's this tzoref, who's this workman with the metal, But by a non-Jew, everybody says it's not nullified because it's clearly going to fix it. Odelma, or maybe maybe there's a dispute by both. So Gemara says, let's try and answer this question. Excuse me. Tashma, Amar Rebbe, Nirin Varai, Kishimachro Lechabla. Says, my position is correct when he sold it, meaning that it's disqualified when he sold it to break it. The Divrei Chaverai, the Chum's position is correct. Shemachro Ovda, if he sold it to work. Milo Chabla, Milo Ovda. What does it mean, Chabla, and what does it mean, Ovda? Ilay Milo Chabla, Chabla Mamish, it means to actually break it, Ovda, Ovda Mamish, and to work and to serve it is actually to serve it my time in the Mandam Bita. What's the reason why the one who says that it is disqualified? For sure, he says that he's going to worship. So, it's not bittul. He sold it to somebody who in the future will break it. Umanu tzarf Yisrael. That's a Jew. And ovda to worship it. That's an idolater. So we see from here. We see from here they're arguing by both because he says, I'm correct in the case of the one who is going to break it. That's the Jew. And he's correct in the case of the one who's going to worship. But we see that they're arguing by both. Gemara says no. Well, Hachikamar, I'm a Rebbe, Niran Barai L'Chaverai, Rebbe says, my words are more correct in the Chachamim when it was sold to somebody L'Chabla, Umrano, who's the one who's going to break it in the future? Tzaref Yisrael, a Jewish worker. Because they only argue with me when it was sold to somebody who's going to worship it. But to somebody who's going to break it, they would agree with. So it says the Gemara Meitzvei. So the Gemara challenged this idea that the Rebbe and the Chamim argue just by a non-Jewish metal worker. So the Gemara says Meitzvei alokeach grutos and ovdei kachamim. Somebody who purchases these coins, this grutos are like pieces of metal, pieces of silver from an idolater. And he finds amongst them idolatry. If he before he gave the money, he pulled it, so he can still give it back. And then he could give it back to the non-Jew and the non-Jew has to disqualify it. And then if he wants to buy it, he could buy it because it was a mistaken Mashiach, because he didn't intend to buy that one, buy the idolatry. But if he already gave the money, he has to take out a portion of it and give that portion to the Yamam. Now, if you want to say B'tzoref Yisrael Machokas, that the dispute of the Tzoref, that the dispute is by a case of a Tzoref who says you could give it back to the non-Jew, and the non-Jew will disqualify it. Hamani Rabbanan either. This is the position of the Rabbanan, that if he sold it to the Jew, it's not disqualified. But if you want to say B'tzoref Avodah Zarah Machokas, but if you want to say it's by an idolater, metal or Yisrael, they're called butter. But if you sold it to a tzaref Yisrael, it's for sure disqualified. How money? Who is this like? Because even if you sold it to a Jew, it wouldn't be nullified, and he should have to give the profit to the Yamamel. So the Gemara says no. Shani Hasam, that gets different. Adapted the grutos of him, since he sold the grutos to sell them. Adapted the avodas kachavim was of him. He didn't sell them for worship. So that case is different. So Gemara hasn't really answered this question. So now the Gemara brings a brisa where the Nachri, about what the Nachri does with his idolatry, whether or not it's disqualified or not. Tana Rabbanan, let's say the idolater borrowed, basically used it as a pledge to borrow money, or if let's say earthquake fell in it or building fell in it, robbers stole it, or if he left it and went overseas. Hold on 1 second. Just give me 1 second. I want to just do one thing. I'll be back in 60 seconds. Okay, so again, what we said in the bottom of 52b is that let's say he borrowed against it, or earthquake fell it in, or robbers borrowed, a robber stole it, or the owner left it and went overseas. On top of the Gimel the Beis, if they're going to return, like the War of Joshua, we'll have to explain what that phrase means, because those Amoraim who went out to fight with Joshua and never came back, then, but if they intend to come back, like the War of Joshua, ain't a batil, it's never nullified. And the Gemara says we need all these cases. If you just said the case of where he borrowed against it, so he says from the fact I didn't actually sell it, I didn't nullify it. But let's say a building fell on it, made a little come anyway, and the fact that he hasn't cleared the rubble, maybe it was nullified. So we need that case. If you just said the case where a building fell on it, Mishum desavar hamanachas koima debeina shakilna. He said, well, it's right there. So whenever I wanted, I could take it. But if robbers stole it, but for the fact that they didn't run after them, it's nullified. And if we said the case where robbers stole it, Mishum desavar, because he's out of position, Yovi Kochavim Shakila Miflak Pocha. He says, if an idolater stole it, he's going to worship it. Yisrael Shakla, if a Jew took it, since it's worth a lot of money, let's sell it to the idolater who Pocha and worship it. But if the owners went overseas, and the fact they didn't take it with them, they nullified it. So so we need all these cases. So it says the Gemara, so if they're going to return, like the War of Joshua, it's not disqualified. First of all, the Gemara says, Midei Muhammad Yoshua Mihadar Hadur. They didn't come back in the War of Joshua. The Amoraim wanted to fight, and they got defeated. So this is what it means. Or if they're eventually going to come back, then it's like the War of Joshua. And it's not disqualified. So if they're going to come back, it's like those who fought, the idols who fought in the War of Joshua, and the Amoraim, which is not disqualified. The Gemara says, why are you bringing in the War of Joshua? Why are you bringing in the War of Joshua? So the Gemara says, Milsa agav orcha kalasma. Teaches us something on the way. It means say, well, it's teaching us one thing. The Gemara is a consummate teacher. It teaches us something on the way. Like, let's say it's like the following case. Let's say you made a brick vertical to bow down to it. And a different idolater came. A Jew set up a brick to bow down to it, and along came, but he never actually did it. An idolater came and bowed down to it, Asra. Then we're going to say, even though the Jew didn't worship it, and even though it's not the idolaters, then it's still going to be disqualified. So since the Jew has revealed his intent, then it's going to be disqualified. And this is learned out, this law is learned out from the thing of the Amoraim, that they went out to fight against Joshua. And so therefore he connects these two laws. I mean, no one to us. Or how do we know? And in that case, where the Jew sets up the brick, it's going to be disqualified. Rabbi Lazar, it's like the case where the Jews entered into the land of Israel. It says, you shall burn their Asherah trees in fire. So how did they prohibit it? Since it was the Jews, how were the idolaters able to prohibit these trees from idolatry? The Jews inherited from their fathers. So how can the idolaters prohibit it by worshiping it? Because the idolaters never owned it to be able to prohibit it. Maybe it was the land of those before the Jews owned it. Well, if that would be the case, it would be enough for the idolaters to nullify it, because they can nullify the Avodah Zarah of theirs, even against their will. Once the Jews worshipped the golden calf, they demonstrated that they actually liked this idolatry. And then when the idolaters came back into the land and worshipped it, it shows that it was like this case where they set up a brick and then the idolaters worshipped it because they had the tree set up. They wanted to worship it, and then the idolaters worshipped it as their agent. That's exactly the case of the brick. The Jew sets up the brick, he doesn't worship it, but the idolater worships it, and he demonstrates that he's fulfilling the Jew's desires. The Gemara says, but wait 1 second. But maybe the Jew only wanted to worship idolatry with a calf, but not with a tree or a brick. The Gemara says, no, Amar Kra, Israel. That Aaron said to the Jewish people by the sin of the golden calf, these are your gods, O Israel. And Eo in the plural, they desired many different gods. In Gemara and Sanhedrin, Samach Gimel, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, we learned out from He'elucha that they, in the plural. The Gemara says, that, so they demonstrated that they wanted many different idolatries. The Gemara says, Ema called about how they egon mitachim, become the Elch mystery. So the Gemara says, maybe all the Asheras that were in the time of the golden calf would be prohibited because they're agents of the Jews, but the ones that were made from after that permitted. The Gemara says, "Ma mochach," yeah, but that would be the case. But how are you able to prove when each one was planted? Says the Mishnah, Avodas kocham shenichu avodas ovda b'shas shalom. Let's say idolater left their idolatry, whose worshippers left it, if it will be a time of peace and terrace, because that then it'll be permitted because they left it, even though they had plenty of time to take it with them. But b'shas milchama, this time of war, asura, it'll be prohibited. B'miosos shamalachim, but if it would be the pedestals that were prepared for the kings, harei mutaros, that will be permitted. Mipnei shema midinosa. Those are permitted because over, because they only put it up when the king is passing by, but when he's not passing, they don't. So basically, they have these like altars that they set up when the king passes by. It's permitted, but they only do that when the king passes by. I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Marav, base Nimrod, Harei Kavod Chavim Shenichu Avodah b'Shashal Matar. What's the base Nimrod? Base Nimrod is the tower that the generation of the Dor HaFlaga built for idolatry in the country that Nimrod was the king. So that's like an idolatry that they left in a time of peace, and it is permitted. So, even though when the Jews when God scattered them, it was like they were being scattered in a time of war. Nevertheless, if they wanted to return after that, they could have. And from the fact that they didn't, bitui bato. It says if you built like these altars, but it was also for a king, it's permitted because they only put them up when the king passes by. So it says, I don't understand this. Just because they put it up when the king passed by, it's permitted. So I'm Rav Bar Chana, Rav Yochanan, this is what the Mishnah means. Because they set it up when the king passes by, and the kings pass by this way, and they go by a different way. And they don't want to specifically worship the idolatry that's in this path. And priests that worship it only made it for the path for when the kings come by. When they see that the kings don't want it, they also nullify it. So therefore, it's not going to be considered like an idolatry. When Ula came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, Yosef Abimsa Pegima, he sat on Bimus, who was established there for idolatry, and it was a little broken. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda Rav Shimon Damar Chevayel Bimus Shenifka Maser, that it's prohibited. I feel a man Damar Einon Demul Shvarm, even according to one that says we don't worship broken pieces. I merely have what's called the deal bay meal, so that's if the idolater breaks it. But this case that it was made as a pedestal for idolater, he doesn't care because you can still put on idolatry, so it should be prohibited. So Ula said to Rabbi Yehuda, he praised this statement. He says, I wish you would give us from the earth of Rav and Shmuel, and And fluorides, they're correct, but we don't agree. The Rabbi Yochanan, that it's permitted if its bimus is a little bit nicked. I feel Mandamar Ovno Shvarm, Hani Mili Avodas Kochavim, given the Pochas Zilo Be Milsa, Avohani Shaku Ai, Maisu Bimus Achlina. Even though there are some who worship a broken piece of idolatry and say that therefore it's prohibited. In this case, it'll be permitted because they don't want to nick the pedestal, and they're going to switch it out. So we'll stop here. This is today's daf. A big shkoyach. You see the beautiful lake behind me. Beautiful lake. Very, very sweet lake. Very quiet. Beautiful. It's a very warm lake here. Shkoyach to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.